I am honored to be here as a board member of the Schumacher Center for New Economics to be diving deep into these ideas that form a legacy out of which we can construct a future vision that we all hope can become a reality in our time. One where small is beautiful, one where all flourishing is mutual. I have a honor to introduce someone who is a friend, a colleague, a mentor, a collaborator to many in this room and in our larger extended community here at the Schumacher Center. It's hard to know how to introduce a man who has been so influential in so many different ways, as a journalist, as a social entrepreneur, someone whose work has resulted in the, I believe it's $100 million that has now been raised and generated to support progressive causes around the world. Peter Barnes has recently donated his archive, his library, to the Schumacher Center, and has also approached us with a desire to inaugurate a prize that this event now serves as the inaugural awarding of the Commonwealth Prize, where we lift up the kinds of ideas that draw from the traditional wisdom, that draw from creative ferment, the blessed unrest, and point towards different futures that we can create together. We are very, very grateful for the ways in which the Commonwealth Prize will continue to nourish and inspire action together as a community into the future. And here to introduce our very first awardee is Peter Barnes. Thank you very much, Peter.
Is somebody working on it? Okay, thank you. It's an honor to meet with the biological descendants of E.F. Schumacher, along with many of his intellectual descendants, of whom I am one. In looking back over my life, which is now over 8 decades long, I can see that the main question that has preoccupied me over time is, what is wrong with capitalism and how can we fix it? The answer to the first part of the question is, I think, fairly obvious, that capitalism, at least as it is organized now, has 2 tragic flaws. It inexorably destroys nature and at the same time widens inequality among humans. The answer to the second part of the question, what can we do, is of course less obvious, but here's what I think it is. This is my short answer. To fix capitalism, add common wealth. The more, the better. Now, if I was going to do a slide or make a t-shirt for this lecture, that would be what was on it. To fix capitalism, add common wealth. We've got a market, it's got a lot of corporations in it. Let's add some common wealth and see what happens. So let me say a few words about common wealth. First, in this context, is 2 words, commonwealth, not a single word, commonwealth, as in Massachusetts. As one word, commonwealth suggests a political entity, but the 2-word phrase refers to a collection of assets that we inherit collectively. This includes everything from our air to water to forests and ecosystems to our financial and legal and political systems and our accumulated customs and science and arts. The value of this commonwealth, to the extent that it can be calculated, far exceeds the value of all private and government wealth. The problem is that commonwealth, like the dark matter of our universe, is invisible. Markets cannot see it. Hence, it is treated as worthless. But the flip side of that is that if we treat our commonwealth with respect and with legal protection, i.e., actual property rights held in trust for future generations and all living persons equally, then markets would work differently. They would work much more as Schumacher and many others here would like markets to work, without that much government intervention. So, what is to be done? Schumacher was one of the first economists to identify natural and social capital as unrecognized contributions to human well-being. Commonwealth is the sum of those two troves of capital, natural and social. The more we protect it, the better markets will protect nature and spread income equitably. Okay, that's not the way things are today. But fortunately, there is a small but growing group of visionaries who are pointing the way along this path. I established the Commonwealth Prize to recognize these visionaries and promote their ideas in coming years, starting today. I thank E.F. Schumacher for lighting the torch and the Schumacher Center for carrying it forward. It is now my privilege to introduce the first recipient of the Commonwealth Prize, Jim Boyce. Jim is an economist, a naturalist, and an expert in climate policy. He got his BA at Yale and his doctorate at Oxford. In other words, he's no slouch. He has studied and worked in India, Bangladesh, Africa, and Central America, and for 30 years was a professor of economics over the hill at UMass Amherst. The reason he is receiving the first Commonwealth Prize is that he is one of the few economists in the US to take Commonwealth seriously at this moment, and to demonstrate, more specifically, to demonstrate how the principles of Commonwealth can be applied to our atmosphere, which is perhaps one of the largest, most important pieces of Commonwealth. Anyway, I had the privilege of working with Jim since 2009 in efforts to enact climate legislation that treats our atmosphere as a shared inheritance. He helped draft the so-called cap and dividend legislation that was introduced, I think in 2009 or 10 by Senator Chris Van Hollen, and has been reintroduced consistently since then. He's got a lot of interesting things to say, and I am pleased to introduce Jim Boyce.
Thank you all for coming out today on a rather dismal day and making it here to Great Barrington. And thanks especially to the Schumacher Center for hosting this event, and to Peter for being the inspiration behind it. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I hope at the end of the day you will also consider it to have been worth your while. It's an honor to be doing this at the Schumacher Center, named after E.F. Schumacher, since I think of him as a free-range economist. And I like to think of myself as a free-range economist as well. And that's not to imply that there are only two kinds of economists. There's a spectrum, of course, but at the other end of the spectrum, if one pursues this metaphor a little unkindly, we have battery chicken economists, or the intellectual equivalent thereof. And in the world today, it's actually that end of the spectrum that seems to have proliferated, and the free rangers are a valiant minority. But I'm happy that a number of them are actually here today with us. And so I want to mention some of them and apologize to those I'm leaving out. I have sitting back there David Bullier and Nancy Fulbray, who with me helped to organize something called the Forum on Social Wealth a few years back. And Nancy and Carol Heim and Michael Ash here are my colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, the economics department of which has long been a center for intellectual diversity and free thought in a profession that often seems to value free markets and everything except ideas. So it's really nice to be here with all of you today. And what I hope I'll be able to do is, as Barbara was discussing, help chart a course between complacency and despair, because I think those are the two pitfalls that we're always in danger of falling into, and perhaps more into the latter at the present moment. So with that, let me begin. Let's see, yeah. So Small is Beautiful, which many of you will have read and know about, has a critique of large-scale property. I don't know if you're going to be able to read what's on the board, and I can't actually read it in my little notes either. So I'm going to have to just summarize from memory if you're not able to read that. But he critiques large-scale private ownership, and he at the same time suggests that public ownership, that is to say state ownership, is not necessarily a solution either. And he quotes the famous historian R.H. Tawney to that effect, saying that the remedy for overaccumulation is not the maintenance of property in private hands, but the decentralized ownership of public property. That was the notion that Schumacher mentioned. And building on that notion, what I want to ask today is, can big be beautiful too? Big and decentralized. Is it possible to think of things that involve the organization of the society at large that require collective effort of all of us to make them happen, that can also be a source of beauty and can also help to enable the kinds of human growth and richness of life that Schumacher was concerned with. So first I want to say a few words about the environment and about nature and how it's conceptualized in economics or not. The economy and the environment, when I went to undergraduate and graduate school, were pretty much disconnected. When I was in grad school, at Oxford, there wasn't a single course in environmental economics. It was not on the curriculum. And that wasn't all that long ago. And the way the economy was thought of was really about interactions, and you can find this picture in every single introductory economics textbook. It's about households and firms. And there's this circular flow between them where the firms provide goods and services to the households, and the households provide dollars to the firms in exchange, and the households provide labor and capital to the firms, and the firms provide dollars to the households in return, and this circular flow merrily spins around. And of course, what's missing from that picture of the economy is the role of the natural world, both as a source of raw materials into the production process and as a sink for the disposal of waste. And once we think about those source and sink functions of nature, we realize that although they are neglected and treated as free and unlimited, in fact, they are not unlimited. There is a finite amount of sources and sink functions of nature that are available to us, and we have to respect those limits. I would say calling those limits to growth is perhaps not the best way to put it, because so many people think of growth as a good thing and growth as the fulfillment of human potential. But I would say it's limits in terms of how much strain we can put on nature in providing these essential services to our economy, hence the box around that picture. The problem with, let's see, there we go. The problem of neglecting the source and sink functions of the environment is sometimes described misleadingly, I would suggest, as the tragedy of the commons. And what I'm going to call it instead is the tragedy of open access, or really the twin tragedies of open access, because there are two of them. So the original parable, the tragedy of the commons parable, is that you have commonly owned grazing land. Everybody can put their cattle on the grazing land. Everybody gets the full benefit of their own cattle, but doesn't pay the cost of depleting the forage available to others. And so the result is that too many cattle are put on and the grazing land is destroyed to the detriment of all. And that is one of the problems with open access. And we can see similar problems if we think about, what it would be like if parking was an open access resource and you could just park wherever you wanted with no cost and no rules. We can see the problem in pollution of our air and water and land. And those are really important environmental problems that come from the neglect of the role of nature as a source and a sink. That's what is sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. It's misnamed because common property is actually often very well managed. And what we're talking about here is a complete absence of any kind of structure of rights, you might call them property rights, over things that are in fact terribly important to our survival. But there's a second tragedy that comes with this as well. The second tragedy that is often neglected, but no less important, I would suggest, is that the absence of well-defined rights over these resources means that they all too often are captured by those with disproportionate wealth and power to the detriment of everyone else. So that's the inequality side of the problem, or one piece of it that Peter referred to. And so thinking more about the consequences of the failure to value nature and both its source and sink functions, we come to what I would call the price conundrum. You may recall that in the wake of the election, the analyses about how we got the result we did, a lot of emphasis was put on prices and inflation. And many thought, and I think there's some evidence this may be true, that high prices were the #1 concern for about half of those who voted for Donald Trump as president. So prices are something that are very visible to people, and people are very sensitive to them. At the same time, we've got a second problem, which is that things that are cheap are often expensive in ways that aren't reflected in their market price. That phrase, cheap is expensive, is one of the take-home lines in a book by Raj Patel and Jason Moore called A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. And so if we think about the costs, the huge environmental costs of things that are artificially cheap, like, for example, fossil fuels, we start to get a sense of the ways in which there are costs that aren't reflected in price tags. But in fact, as long as they're not, these things are going to be overconsumed, used too much. The fact that they have environmental costs will be neglected, and people will fail to take it into account. So we've got this problem that people are very sensitive to price increases in the price of gasoline or eggs or what have you, and at the same time, some prices, in some meaningful sense, are too low. They're not sending the signal about the true costs involved in our decisions in production and consumption. So how can one deal with the problem that prices are too low and raise prices to something more reflective of the true impacts and values? Well, one way to do that, of course, would be to raise people's incomes enough to afford those increases in prices. But here we come to another set of conundrums. Mathematically, there's a symmetry between income and prices. Real income, which is a concept in economics, is purchasing power adjusted for inflation, and both purchasing power and income are very visible. People know what the prices are that they face, and they know what their incomes are. And so on some level, you think, okay, you can raise prices as long as you raise incomes. Things are good. But there's a political asymmetry in that for most people, they think of prices as something that are beyond their control. Prices are something that are done to them. They go to the gas station, they go to the grocery store, and they see the price tag, and they think, they're doing it to me. If those prices are going up, it may be the corporations, it may be the government, but somebody is doing it to them. Whereas in the case of income, incomes appear to be the result of our own efforts. We take the credit for our incomes. Maybe the administration may have good economic policies that encourage job growth and so on, but a lot of the people who benefit from that job growth think it's really their own efforts that have account for their higher incomes, that they're not done to them, they're done by them. And so the question is, how do we raise prices that are too low while not provoking a political backlash? And one way to do so in principle would be to have some sort of universal basic income that accompanies the correction of prices. Because universal basic income would be highly visible. It would be something that is equal for all. It's not because of our own excessive merit that we get more. Everybody gets the same. And it could, in certain ways, help to set the stage for allowing prices that are too low to be raised without provoking a backlash. But the conundrum, of course, with universal basic income is how to pay for it. How are we going to pay for a universal basic income? That's always what it comes up against. Let me turn now to the climate, which involves these twin tragedies of open access, abuse of the environment, enrichment of the powerful and wealthy at the expense of everyone else on a planetary scale. We can easily figure out what we would need to do in order to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century. This curve shows a constant rate of diminution of emissions. It's curved because it's an exponential line. It's like compound growth in reverse. And it leaves a little bit of fossil fuel emissions at the end that maybe could be compensated for by sequestration, by reforestation or other means. But this curve shows a 90% reduction by 2050, which would imply reducing emissions at a rate of something like 8% per year. And we can see what that path would be. And the question is, how could we possibly have such a path? So that's what I want to consider. Because to have such a path, to reduce the supply of fossil fuels, would raise the prices of fossil fuels, would raise them quite a bit. And that's like telling kids, eat your broccoli. It doesn't taste good, but it's good for you. You got to do this. And anybody who's ever sat across a table from a kid like this will know that that's a hard sell for a lot of people. One way to do it would be to put a cap on carbon and capture the money by selling permits to import those fossil fuels, the carbon contained into the economy. Those would be have to be turned over by the fossil fuel suppliers for every ton of carbon they bring in. Take that money, that's called a cap. That cap would be set to correspond to that pathway I just showed to hit net zero, and take the money and recycle it to the people as equal per capita dividends. And if one were to do that following a trajectory, actually a more modest trajectory than the one I just showed, a trajectory designed to hit 80% reduction by 2050. In the first 10 years, if you figure out, well, what's likely to be the price effect of those reductions in supply of fossil fuels, you come out over the first 10 years that the revenue per person, this is for the United States, would amount to about $2,400 per year. That's for every man, woman, and child in the country. So for a family of 4, you're talking about roughly $10,000 a year. And particularly for low-income people, that's a lot of money. That would be, in theory, one way you could actually meet the goal of reducing your carbon consumption as a society, and do it in a way that the higher prices that would result from contraction of the supply of fossil carbon were compensated with these, what we now call carbon dividends. Maybe we should have called them climate protection dividends, but we called it carbon dividends, and that's out there now. So the problem is, if you're going to have a cap and you're going to increase prices of fossil fuels, who's going to get the money? And you may remember the phrase cap and trade, which put caps in general into disrepute. That was the kind of legislation that was proposed in the first decade of this century on Capitol Hill. 3 times there were bills that came up for a vote. 3 times they lost, the last time very closely. That was the Waxman-Markey bill. And the basic principle behind cap and trade was that you would put a cap on, you would limit the supply, prices of fossil fuels would go up, that would change people's behavior and so on. And you would give away the permits, or at least a big chunk of the permits, to the fossil fuel firms based on their historic supply of fossil fuels, a practice somewhat offensively on ageist and sexist grounds called grandfathering. And the firms would be able to keep the money they got from the higher prices for fossil fuels. And the idea was this would buy their acquiescence to having a cap. This would be the way you bought them into the climate bargain. And unfortunately, it didn't work. At the end of the day, the firms turned out to have 2 plans. One plan was this: if we have to have legislation, but plan B was not to have legislation at all, and that's what they really wanted. So the way that this then works is you have free permits given away for the limited amount of fossil fuels you allow into the country. You distribute the profits in proportion to ownership of stocks, meaning the rich get most of the profits and some of it goes to foreign shareholders. That was meant to be the political bargain which would allow us to put a cap on carbon. And it failed. It narrowly failed in the Senate. It had passed the House on a strictly partisan vote, all the Democrats against, all the Republicans, all the Democrats for, all the Republicans against, and then it failed in the Senate. So that's one option for what you do if you have a cap on carbon. A second option, which is popular, or used to be popular at least among many on the Democratic side, is that you put the cap. An alternative would be to have a carbon tax, by the way. It does much the same thing. And you let the government keep the money, and the government does something with the money that you hope will be a good thing. So that could include spending on environmental projects. It could include spending on the military. It could include tax cuts, deficit reduction, you name it. It depends on what the people on Capitol Hill decide to do with the money. And today, of course, this may not be quite as popular an idea with liberals as it once was. The third possibility, and the one that Peter long advocated, and I've been advocating for a long time too, almost as long as Peter, but not quite, is what we call cap and dividend, which is what I alluded to earlier, which is instead of giving away the permits for free to corporations and letting them earn windfall profits or receive windfall profits, instead of letting the government keep the money and do with it what it wishes, we return the money back to the people on an equal per capita basis. And the idea here is that the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere belongs to us all in equal and common measure. Distributionally, one of the nice things about such a system is that since everybody gets the same amount back, but the increase in prices affects people depending on how much they consume, the vast majority of working households, working families, get back more than they consume. And it's the highest spending households, the most affluent households, which have outsized carbon footprints, that pay in more than they get back, but they can afford it. So under the cap and dividend system, to recap, the permits are auctioned, the revenue is recycled to the public on an equal per capita basis. It protects the purchasing power of working families. And this idea did not win over the Democratic Party in the first decade of this century. There were two bills, actually. There was Van Hollen's bill. He was in the House at that time that Peter referred to. And in the Senate, there was the last bipartisan bill on climate policy to date, which was introduced by Senators Maria Cantwell, Democrat of Washington, and Susan Collins, Republican of Maine. And the Democratic leadership bottled both bills up in committee, never brought them to the floor, putting all its eggs in the cap and trade basket, with the results that we have been living with ever since. The Van Hollen bill continues to be reintroduced every 2 years. It's now called Van Hollen-Beyer because Representative Don Beyer from Virginia, along with Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, both introduced the exact same bill every 2 years. And I have the URL down there if anybody wants to get it, but you can easily find this by going to the website where bills and their legislative history are made public, which they haven't taken down yet as far as I know. It's called the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act. If you just Google that, you'll come to it. And it's a bill that does exactly, or would do if it became law, exactly what I've just described. And unlike Waxman-Markey, which was 400 pages long, much of it dealing with derivatives and trading and all this kind of stuff, there's no tradable permits in this bill because if you have firms buy the permits, they don't have to trade them. And the whole bill's 24 pages long. So it's actually, I recommend it if you can stand wading through legislation. This is about the nicest legislation you're gonna ever get a chance to wade through. Let's see. Yeah, and there's a Scientific American endorsed this back in 2009. That's a nice little graphic they produced to sort of demonstrate the idea that it comes from the polluters, goes to Uncle Sam, then goes back into our pockets. A different circular flow than the one we started out with. So the strengths of a carbon dividend policy, to wrap that up, are first that politically, by ensuring that people actually get the money back into their own pockets and therefore can afford the higher prices of fuels and come out ahead, it helps to build durable public support for the policy, something that was notably lacking in the case of Waxman-Markey and the cap and trade bills. Second, that economically, it achieves a progressive distributional impact, that is to say, it raises the incomes net of the higher fuel prices of working people while reducing those at the very top of the income distribution. And finally, philosophically, it embodies the idea of universal ownership of commonwealth. The one major weakness of this policy is the reason why most of you have probably never heard of it, which is that nobody gets rich from this policy. And if nobody gets rich, nobody pays anybody to lobby about it, do propaganda about it, publicize about it, go to Capitol Hill and talk to Congress people about it. It just doesn't happen because there's nobody who's going to really make it big from this policy, which means not that it's impossible to happen, but that for it to happen, it would require ordinary people, people like you and me, people without deep pockets, but with deep commitments to go and make it happen. And that, of course, is a big ask, but saving the planet is a big ask too. So we may have to rise to that challenge. So this is an example of a broader concept to which Peter alluded called universal property. And universal property, of which carbon dividends would be an example, has three key features. One is that it is individual. It's property owned by individuals. Individuals get the dividends. Second, it's inalienable. It can't be sold or transferred to anyone else. It comes as a right, not as a commodity for sale. And thirdly, that it is perfectly egalitarian. Everybody has the same entitlement, the same right to the fruit of that property. And so that's a concept of property which I think helps to fill a missing piece in our current structure of property rights. It's not entirely missing, because an example of something like this exists of all places in the state of Alaska. Some of you may have heard of it. When Alaska started pumping oil in the 80s, the Republican governor at the time, Jay Hammond, came up with the idea of the Alaska Permanent Fund, which basically charges a royalty on every barrel of oil pumped in the state, puts it into a fund, and uses that fund to pay out annual dividends equal per person to every resident of Alaska, every woman, every man, and every child. And those dividends have varied over time, but around $2,000 a year per person is what they've been most recently. And I think that's kind of an example of treating something as universal property. It has one really important difference from carbon dividends, which is that for the people of Alaska, a lot of them would like to keep pumping more oil, because the more you pump, the bigger your dividend, right? Whereas in the case of climate protection dividends or carbon dividends that come from limiting the use of fossil fuels, it's ratcheting down the supply and use of fossil fuels that generates the income, not increasing it. So just to briefly, this is the first time I've ever created this picture, so I want to share it with you. This is kind of filling the missing gap. I think we can think about 4 different types of property that are distinguished both in terms of their scope, whether they're micro or macro, whether they operate at the level of individual units or the system as a whole, and on the other axis, the risk of concentration and centralization, those things that Schumacher warned against in Small is Beautiful. And so the risk of concentration could be high or low. And here are the existing forms of property, the first 3. One's private property. It's micro, it's individual units, but it has a high risk of concentration in a few hands. Not to say there shouldn't be any, but that's a risk. A second is state property, which is at the macro level, but that too has a high risk of concentration, what Schumacher and Tawney warned about, centralization, too big in some sense. The concentration of power can result in state policies that aren't necessarily good for the environment or good for people. A third type is common property. That's what's been lifted up by many authors, including David Bollier back here, which is at the micro level, at the level of communities, and it involves their control over often natural resources like water, grazing lands, fisheries, and so on, that are often used sustainably and for the benefit of all, and have relatively low risk of concentration and centralization. And finally, the last box that I've filled in here is universal property, which again is at the level, the macro level of the system as a whole, and combines that level of organization with low risk of concentration in a few hands. In fact, no risk as long as the basic tenets that I laid out are respected. And so what universal property involves is the decentralized ownership of public property. It's trying to kind of put flesh on that notion that's there in Tawney and quoted by Schumacher in Small is Beautiful. What would decentralized ownership of public property look like? And this, I think, is what it at least could look like. Tawney, again, that same quote back, the remedy for over-centralization is not the maintenance of property in private hands, but the decentralized ownership of public property. I think that is an insight that has been almost like a seed dormant in the literature for a long time that is starting to blossom today. This is something I stumbled across in the Ministry of Public Education in Mexico City years ago with my wife Betsy. There's a big mural by Diego Rivera, the great Mexican artist, and this is one little panel from the mural. And at the bottom I saw this inscription written in a kind of antiquated Spanish that says, the land belongs to all, just like the water, the light, and the heat of the sun. And I think that notion of universal property that I've just described is one that is widely shared across cultures, across societies around the world. And it's one that could be made a principle, an operating principle, not only here, but in every country in the world. This is the way we usually think of the political landscape. Fortunately, you know, the little blue parts are where a lot of people live, but still that's our US political landscape today. And we define that landscape as being about left and right. And we have understandings of what left and right mean. And those understandings date from the end of the 1700s and early 1800s. And the basic idea around which left and right debates have been organized for a long time as a way to think about the political spectrum has to do with the balance between the market on the one side and the state on the other. How much government control of the market, with right being more market, left being more state. And what I want to submit to you is that there's another political spectrum that is at least as important, I think probably more important, and that was being alluded to by Tawney and Schumacher in those quotes that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's really orthogonal. It's at right angles to the state market axis. And it's the continuum, the spectrum between, on the one hand, democracy, and on the other hand, oligarchy. And that's not part of the conventional notion of left and right, which is really about state and market. Now, the right-wing people try to conflate the market with democracy and the state with oligarchy, and the left-wing people tend to make the reverse spin and equate the untrammeled market with oligarchy and the state with democracy. But I want to submit to you that no matter how you strike the balance between the market and the state, I'm not saying that's an uninteresting question, it's an important question, but it's not the main question. The main question is, are wealth and power that are correlated together, of course, concentrated in the hands of the few, or are they widely dispersed among all the people of the society? That's a difference that shapes profoundly how both states and markets operate. And I would submit to you, in an oligarchic situation, no matter what your mix of market and state, you're going to get outcomes that tend to be bad for the environment and bad for most people in that society. So that, I think, is the spectrum we need to have first and foremost in our mind when we're talking about the political landscape. That's the Louis Brandeis quote that some of you may remember. He was a very distinguished Supreme Court justice earlier in the 20th century. He said, we must make a choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. And I think that really sums up what I see as that side of the political spectrum. What we are encountering today, of course, is something like the emergence of an oligarchy. Here we have in the front row at Donald Trump's inauguration in January, we have some of the new tech oligarchs. You will recognize them. There they are, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, and of course, the now famous Elon Musk. We have happening now in our country, I would submit to you, a movement along that axis between democracy and oligarchy towards increasing oligarchy. And you know, people sometimes describe what's going on now as a movement towards fascism. And I think there is a connection between oligarchy and fascism. The way I was thinking about earlier today, it's like these are afflictions, you know, this is a medical metaphor, afflictions of the body politic, right? If you have toxic exposures that aren't enough to kill you, but just sort of make you feel sick, those are called chronic exposures. And if it's acute enough to actually kill you, to make you drop dead, that's an acute exposure. And I think of fascism really as sort of the acute version of oligarchy. And I hope we don't quite get there. Universal property, to wrap up then, is, I think, a form of wealth, a decentralized form of wealth, which is a property counterpart of democracy. It helps to maintain some level playing field at the base in terms of people's income, people's wealth, that cannot be eroded over time, that indeed could be expanded over time as more and more assets become incorporated into the realm of universal property. I think starting with carbon and climate is a good place to start because it addresses one of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. But I see that really as the beginning, not the end of what could emerge if universal property were to take its place alongside, not replacing, but alongside private property, state property, and common property where those already exist. It would help to correct these fundamental flaws, not only of capitalism. You may recall there was what they used to call actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union. You know? It would address a fundamental flaw of modern economic systems, whatever their position along the market-state axis may be. So I will stop there. Thank you all very much for coming. I would be happy to take questions. If you are interested in reading more about these things, Peter Barnes wrote a great book that I recommend to you called Ours, The Case for Universal Property. I myself wrote a book called The Case for Carbon Dividends. I think these are both available in another room. And Brent Rinaldi, who's here somewhere in the audience, also wrote a terrific book, more, I would say, scholarly treatment of this topic, going back to the intellectual and legal origins of the concept, called Commonwealth Dividends, History and Theory. All three of those books kind of put more flesh on the bones of what I've just sketched out today. So thank you again for coming.